Beirut first. Oliver Marsden is a journalist for The Times. He has a fascinating piece in The Times today, which we'll talk to Oliver about. He was taken on a trip effectively by Hezbollah yesterday. But first question, Oliver, thank you for coming on the line, sir. We hear what the US is saying. How will that go down, do you imagine, in the region? Morning to you.
Good morning. Yes, I mean, the US is saying they won't back these strikes. I think that will maybe, I think originally, initially it'll cause some relief. I think, an Israeli retaliation that would target Iranian sites could, nuclear sites could be incredibly dangerous and escalatory for the region. So I think people will be looking at that and sort of breathing maybe a small sigh of relief. But unfortunately, in the region, there's not a lot of trust with the Americans. They've talked about wanting a ceasefire. They've talked about de-escalation. And from, points of view here in this region, they keep arming the Israelis and the Israelis keep bombing. So I don't think there's a lot of trust or love towards the Americans right now.
How is day-to-day life in Beirut, Oliver?
Well, I mean, in general, the whole city is starting to feel a little bit like a ghost town. Everyone's hunkering down, everyone's staying in. There's a feeling permeating of tension. That being said, there's hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced. Almost 1 million Lebanese people have been displaced by this conflict, and so those who have moved up from the south have moved to Beirut, and now the hotels are full. People sleeping in Martyrs Square, the main square downtown, in parks, on the beach, the public beach here, on the Corniche. So there's a sort of strange mixture of it being tense and quiet, but also a lot of people still being in the city. Those that can, obviously the other people have moved out of Beirut. They've moved further north up towards Tripoli, the city in the north, and a lot of people have tried to leave on these flights and these evacuation planes that were leaving the last few days.
Well, that was my next question. The exodus continues from the airports and the ports, I understand, Oliver.
Yes, so we had, I think, the British plane, charter plane left yesterday. We had a Portuguese military plane leave a few days before that. The ports, yes, up the coast from sort of just north of Beirut all the way up to Tripoli. Each country, each embassy seems to have found a landing spot for their ferries going to Cyprus, all the warships. I believe the British have got 2 warships sat in Cyprus at the moment. And so, the exodus continues, and the embassies here are desperately telling their citizens to leave.
To get out, indeed. Okay, lastly, let's turn to the fascinating piece you filed in today's Times newspaper. You had an interesting day trip yesterday. Tell the listeners about it.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. It's an interesting school trip. Yeah, we were invited by Hezbollah to Dahiyeh, which is the southern suburb in Beirut, to go and see some of these strike sites. It's not always easy to get in there. And it's quite dangerous because these areas are still being hit by the Israeli military. So we were taken on this tour to see these strike sites by Hezbollah and their minders. They were pretty cordial, and it was sort of strange, as you say. There was a lot of journalists there. It was a bit of a press circus, but we did see some really large-scale destruction. And this area is very much a densely populated residential area. It's all high, apartment blocks and high-rise apartment blocks. There are schools, there are mosques, and this destruction has come right in the middle of it and leveled many buildings. I think some of my photos made it into the piece, and you can see the levels of destruction.
It's extraordinary. But what also comes across, Oliver, there's a level of defiance with some of the people with whom you spoke.
Of course. I mean, when we arrived, the streets were empty. It was a complete ghost town in Dahiyeh, and rubble all over the place, broken glass. Obviously, these level buildings. But then we started to see some residents venturing out. I spoke to some who, as you said, there was defiance. They were like, well, we're not going to be cowed by what's happening, even if Nasrallah's dead. We're going to win. Hezbollah's going to win. And quite interestingly, we heard that some residents had come back because the journalists were there. They felt safe to come home to pick up their belongings. One woman had come back to pick up all her cats because she felt there was safety there because the journalists were there, rightly or wrongly. So yeah, and there is a feeling of defiance.
All right.
for sure.
You look after yourself, Oliver. Thanks for your time this morning. Oliver Marsden, journalist for The Times, talking to me from Beirut. And I say again, fascinating piece. Imagine being taken on a trip by Hezbollah, 13 after 7. Let's put some of those points to Arthur Snell, who's a former British diplomat and international security expert. So we hear from a warning of sorts from President Joe Biden. What do you think the reaction will be in Tel Aviv? Morning to you.
Good morning, Nick. I mean, I think there's a degree to which the limitations of America's influence on Israel are pretty clear. We saw America trying to come up with a ceasefire plan for Israel and Hezbollah. And, earlier in this sort of crisis, which of course now been going for a year, there have been times when America appears to be trying to tell the Israelis what to do in Gaza, and there's limits on the degree to which they're listening. Having said all of that, I don't think that means that we can assume the Israelis are about to bomb the Iranian nuclear facilities, which obviously would be a very considerable task.
What do you think happens next?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot more of what we've seen in the last 24, 48 hours. So that there's clearly a tough fight happening on the ground in South Lebanon. There was the sad news of 8 Israeli soldiers having died there. And we're reminded that although Hezbollah has lost its leadership and clearly is being devastated by recent strikes, it still has thousands of armed men. It still controls that ground in South Lebanon. And it may be perhaps starting to reconstitute its leadership as well.
This is, of course, a holiday period for the Israelis, so it may go quiet, it may not. Then we come to that rather grim 12-month anniversary. What do you see happening around that time, Arthur?
Well, I think clearly there'll be a lot of pressure on Netanyahu around this question of the hostages, because this remains, to some extent, I think his Achilles heel, that Israelis understand the need to secure their country, and he's got a lot of support, and the IDF, perhaps more importantly, has a lot of support. But it remains the case that there are hostages there in Gaza, and that there are credible allegations, I think, that Netanyahu has sort of ignored opportunities to get them out in pursuit of this war.
Grateful for your time, Arthur Snell. Thank you. You served as a British diplomat. You're an international security expert. By the way, the hostages and the number of how many they believed are still alive is something I explore with with Israel's ambassador to the UN, or the UN Israeli ambassador, in the next hour in a recorded interview.